Hey, welcome to the Breakaway Podcast. We hope you enjoy the talks and stick around for more at the end.
We are in the final section of the Gospel of Mark. And this is the section that covers the resurrection of Jesus, something that millions of people around the world were celebrating this last weekend. And as I thought about presenting this text to you tonight, I thought about my Easter service experience growing up, because when I was a kid, Easter services were always a little different. We did them before the sun rose. We'd pull the chairs out into the parking lot, and we would do it outside. We'd put 3 crosses out on the baseball field, and there was always this one moment. It was the most memorable part of the Easter service for me. There was this woman that would walk around, and she would always find you and just kind of look you straight in the eye and just say, "He is risen." And I found out later that there was an appropriate response to this. You're supposed to say, "He is risen indeed." And that's kind of how the exchange goes. I have no idea where that came from, but it's kind of a thing. And but even after I learned that that was the right response, she still always caught me off guard, and I was still always a little freaked out, and I was just unaccustomed to that as a greeting. And so every year, I would be there, and she would find me and just go, "He is risen." And I would say, "Okay." And that was kind of our moment. And I thought of that as I thought of this moment, because I just think for so many of us, there are millions of us that are celebrating this season saying, "He is risen." And there are millions of non-Christians. And if we're honest tonight, in here there are non-Christians and there are Christians, that your response to that is, "Okay." And it's not, "Oh, I hate that, I'm not into that." But it's not just fantastic awe and wonder and celebration. It's, okay. Like, I respect that, that's cool, I know it's a big deal, but I don't fully grab it. It doesn't fill me with a sense of wonder. And so what I want to do tonight is I want to walk you through this text where Mark presents to us the resurrection. And I just want to move you through the text to see what is this moment that millions of people throughout centuries have celebrated and made the cornerstone of their life. And so we're going to walk through it, but I'll tell you what's going to happen tonight, and I believe this. We're not just going to read an ancient text about something that happened a long time ago. This is extremely relevant for us today, and as we look at it, it's going to engage us in our minds and in our hearts and in our lives. And so as we jump in, I just want to grab it. Starting in verse 1, it says, "When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him." Now, who are these women? I'm not going to tell you their whole life story, but Mark has told us a little about them in the previous chapter. He's told us that these women were witnesses of Jesus' crucifixion. He said in verse 40, "There were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph and Salome." And then he gives us some of their background in the next verse. He says, "When he was in Galilee," meaning Jesus, "they followed him and ministered to him. And there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem." And then he lets us know they were witnesses of his burial. It says in verse 47, "Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph saw where he was laid." So these are women who did life with Jesus in Galilee. They followed him to Jerusalem. They watched him die. And then they saw where he was buried. And now we're linking up with them. It says when the Sabbath was past. The Sabbath in the Jewish calendar was a Saturday. Jesus was killed on a Friday. And then for them, a day started when the sun went down. So what we would call Friday night, for them, as soon as the sun went down, that was Saturday. And on the Sabbath, you couldn't do any work. It was against the law. You couldn't buy anything. All the shops were closed. And so when Jesus died on Friday, Joseph of Arimathea had to hurry up and get him buried before the sun went down. And he didn't accomplish all the burial rites. And yet the Sabbath came, everything shut down, the women had to wait, and then what we would call Saturday night came around for them, beginning of Sunday, the first day of the week. They went out and probably Sunday or Saturday night, that first part of Sunday, they went out and bought these spices. And then verse 2 tells us, and very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. Now you go, what are these spices about? Well, these spices, I've heard people say they were to mummify Jesus. That's not quite right. The Jews didn't mummify people. But it was perfume. And it says they wanted to anoint him. That means they would pour this perfume on the body, and then they would set these perfume bottles around the body. And just quite honestly, if you go, what's that about? It was a burial rite, and the purpose was to offset the odor of decomposition. And so these women come, and it says, on the sun had risen, they went to the tomb, but verse 3 says, and they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? Now the women are on their way there, and they remember, they were there when Jesus got buried. The way it worked is they would roll this stone in front of a tomb. These stones were about 6 feet high, weighed several hundred pounds, and so they were easy to get in place because they would carve these little grooves, but once they got in there, very hard to move. And so what Mark is telling us is these dear women just did not plan ahead. They remembered the spice thing. They got the spices down, and so they walked there, and they're like, okay, you know what? We remember the spices. We totally forgot the 8 to 10 dudes it's going to take to move this rock. And so they're walking there going, how are we going to handle this? Because they know they don't have the juice to move this thing on their own. But it says in verse 4, and looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back, and it was very large. Thanks, Mark. We covered that. But then verse 5 says, and they entered the tomb, and they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. Now, Mark doesn't tell us he's an angel. Matthew and Luke do. But that description, young man in a white robe, that's in actually a lot of Jewish literature how angels are described. And so these women are expecting a closed tomb, expecting a dead body. They find an open tomb, and they find an angelic being. And so the text says they were alarmed, which is pretty standard when the divine breaks into the human story to feel that way. Now, that word is actually a hard word to translate. Some of your texts may say they were amazed. Some may say they were terrified. The word actually, it just generally means intense emotional response. And so we don't know. Is it positive, negative? We don't know. All we know is they had an expectation. When they got there, it looked very different. So they walked in and just went, oh! And it was like, okay, was that positive, negative? What are we doing? We don't know. We just know they freaked out. And so the angel tells them in verse 6, he says to them, do not be alarmed, which is actually very typical angel talk. Whenever the divine steps into the human story, it freaks people out. A lot of angels have to tell him to dial it down, and he does. And then he starts to give them perspective. He says, you seek Jesus of Nazareth. He says, I know who you're here for. You're here for Jesus. And there's a lot of Jesus around here, so let me just be clear. You're here for Jesus of Nazareth. That's who he came here for, and that's who I know you're here for. Jesus, the one from Nazareth, who was crucified. Just in case there's some other Jesus of Nazareth running around out there that we're not aware of, the Jesus of Nazareth that was crucified. You saw him get crucified. We all know he got crucified. The Jesus of Nazareth that was crucified, that's who you came here to see. So you're not at the wrong tomb. You're not in the wrong place. You came to see that Jesus. You came to the right place to see that Jesus, but he's not here. You already know that. You look around, he's not here. Come see the place where they laid him. He's not there. And the reason he's not there is because he's risen. He's not here because he's not dead anymore. Now, we need to stop in a moment. This is the first part where I want to apply it to us, because Mark has been doing something in these first 6 verses that is tremendously significant. And I think some of us are probably missing what he's been doing that's monumental. Up until now, Mark has been presenting this as if he's reporting history. See, he's presenting this as something that actually happened. See, it's interesting. In this time, they had historical reporting and they had mythology. They did not have this category we have of realistic fiction. That did not exist. And so you're either reporting history or you're writing myth. And I'm in a class right now in seminary where I'm reading a bunch of myths from Assyria and Babylon and Egypt and Mesopotamia. And I got to tell you something, none of them sound like this. They're all symbolic language and real mystically weird with dragons. They don't sound like this. And so Mark is presenting real people with real expectations. He's presenting this as if this happened in history. And you see it with the way he's repeating the names. Did you notice with the women? That's why I wanted to show you those verses. He keeps repeating their names. There's design to that. And you really see it when he names a couple verses earlier when he's talking about Jesus carrying the cross. He said Simon of Cyrene carried his cross, which a lot of you know that. Jesus couldn't handle it after a while, so Simon of Cyrene carried it. The way Mark presents it, he says Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, carried his cross. Which if you were just reading that on your own now, you would read that and go, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, carried his cross. And you'd go, okay, father of Alexander and Rufus. Tell him I said hi. I don't know. Congratulations. That doesn't land on you. But when you think about it, all through the Gospels, they don't name that many people. And yet Mark says this, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Why does he say that? Because the early audience would have known Alexander and Rufus. So he's saying, Simon, you know the father of Alexander and Rufus. And their response would be, Yeah, totally. Alex, that's your dad? You didn't tell us that. Your dad's in the Bible. Oh. And he's doing it with these women, continuing to repeat their names. Why is he doing that? He's doing it because there are people who could verify the story. That's how you did historical reporting then. You would name your sources. Don't just take my word for it. There are other people, like 1 Corinthians 15 said, he appeared to many, most of whom are still alive. There are other people out here that can verify this story. This is not just a religious kind of feel-good story I'm making up that you believe out here to help you sleep at night, but real history and real life happens here. I'm telling you the divine broke into history, and these people can verify that. And so it's interesting. C.S. Lewis, who's a professor at Oxford, was an atheist, became a Christian, was an expert in ancient literature. That was his field. He said this. He said, I've been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, and myths all my life. I know what they are like. I know none of them are like this. There are only two possible views. Either this is reportage, or else some unknown ancient writer without known predecessor or successor suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern novelistic realistic narrative. The reader who does not see this has simply not learned how to read. So he's a little condescending there at the end. He's a professor. It's kind of the vibe. But you get the idea. And yet there are critics, and there's some alive today, and you can go to Barnes & Noble in the Christian section and find their books. Dominic Crossan is a big one. Time Newsweek loved to interview him around this time of year because he's real controversial. But he says, yeah, what happened was Jesus died, and his followers just couldn't handle it. They just couldn't imagine the guy they had put so much behind, so invested in, had died. And so years later, long afterwards, they were just sitting around going, this just can't be the way it played out. Let's just talk like he's still alive. Let's talk like death wasn't the end. Let's talk like he came back, and we'll just kind of craft these stories of what if he was still here. And then they realized, we can get some energy back in this movement if we talk about him being alive. And so let's craft this story of him being alive, and we can kind of get some momentum back in this thing, and let's get this thing driving. We can get some juice into this thing again if we get going and just tell people he's really alive. But there's a problem with that view. There's a lot of problems with that view, and we won't cover all of them, but there's two things you see in Mark's text that militate against that. The first thing is simply, who are the eyewitnesses? Who are the eyewitnesses? They're women. Which you go, that may not shock you, but it would back then because, no offense, ladies, but women were not as valued in that culture. The testimony of women was certainly not valued in that culture. In law cases in Jerusalem, when they were serious cases, the testimony of women was not admissible as evidence. It wasn't valuable. Celsus, who was a 2nd century philosopher. You probably aren't reading a whole lot of Celsus. You don't need to. But Celsus was in the 2nd century, loathed Christianity, wrote anti-Christian books. One of his big heavyweight arguments against Christianity, the one he waited for in the debate and just fired off, was he would say, and who was it who saw this? Women? And that argument was like, boom. Because back then that was like, oh, man, he's right. Women, because he said women who are hysterical. Like, we all know that. Women are hysterical. And so back then they were like, oh my gosh, he's right. This really shoots a bullet into this thing. Women are the people who saw this? Oh my gosh. And it really was something Christians had to deal with back then, but actually it really helps us now because if you were creating this story later to try to get some energy behind your movement, the last thing you would do is put women at the tomb. That would hurt your argument. You wouldn't craft it this way. The only reason Mark would do this, and Matthew and Luke and John, is because it actually happened this way. That's the only reason you'd write that. And yet there are some people who look at it and go, well, okay, Ben, but the truth is, back in the day, they were more open to supernatural answers for everything. They were just like, any problem, they were like, that was the tree fairies. They're always coming up with supernatural answers for different things. The modern rationalistic mind knows better. And so they probably went to the tomb and were like, his body's not here. And rather than someone stole it or some natural thing, they went, maybe he's back from the dead. Let's go with it. All right, and that's kind of what happened. But the truth is, look at the text. Why did the women show up at the tomb? Why did they bring spices? It's because they thought he was dead. They didn't go thinking maybe he was out. And that's really compelling when you read the rest of Mark. You know, Mark's a very short book. It's a very concise book. And yet 5 times in the book of Mark, Jesus told his disciples, I'm going to die and then not stay dead. 3 times he told them it would be 3 days later. And you know, in Mark, if something's getting repeated, that means Jesus was saying it a lot. That he's walking with them and saying, hey guys, we're on our way to Jerusalem. I just want to let you know, I'm going to die when I get there, but 3 days later, I'm rising from the dead. The next day, he's like, guys, a little closer. Just wanted to put this back in your world. We're going to get there, die, 3 days, up. Just want you to know that. Hey guys, we're on the edge of the city. Just before we go in, just want to make it clear, in case anybody forgot, going in, dying, 3 days, rising. Put it on your calendars. Andrew, remind the boys. Tell Peter he's forgetful. 3 days, up. Dead, 3 days, up. And he keeps saying it. So if Mark is fabricating this story, the natural ending would be, after all those reminders, would be what? 3 days later, the boys are sitting around, and one of them goes, didn't he say something about 3 days later? Should we stop by there? I know this is crazy, but what else are we doing? Let's just go for it. And they go there and go, the tomb's empty, he's risen. Credits roll, it sells 1 million copies. It's a big winner. But the disciples aren't there. As much as he told them, they don't show up. Why? Because, look, the Greeks were not looking for a physical resurrection for the body. For them, salvation was the spirit being liberated from the physical earth. They weren't looking for a physical resurrection. And the Jews believed in a final resurrection at the end of days. They were not expecting Messiah who would beat death like this. Nobody was looking for this. They were unprepared. It threw them off guard. And yet, Bible aside, historically, you can't deny that what happened was suddenly a community of Jewish and Greek people were filled, consumed with the idea that their Messiah, the God-man, lived, died, and beat death. And within 2 centuries, they spread that message to the entire known world. And it is now the largest religion on the planet. And liberal scholars today have absolutely no answer for us. They don't. They have no explanation for why these people who had no expectation of this kind of thing suddenly were willing to live for it, proclaim it, and die for it. There's no rational explanation for this except that it happened. And so Anne Rice, who's a fiction writer, wrote the Interview with the Vampire Lestat, books that I'm not recommending to you. She was in a dark phase. Don't read them. But she decided, I remember reading an article a couple of years ago where she said she wanted to write about the life of Christ and she wanted to write it first person, which I thought, oh, Anne, please don't. That's just so many pitfalls. But she went for it. And I read the first one. It actually wasn't that bad. But Anne Rice said this. She said, I wanted to write the life of Jesus Christ. And having started with the skeptical critics, those who take their cue from the early skeptical New Testament scholars of the Enlightenment, I expected to discover that their arguments would be frighteningly strong, and that Christianity was, at heart, a kind of fraud. And I'd have to end up compartmentalizing my mind with faith in one part of it and truth in another. What gradually became clear to me was that many of the skeptical arguments that insisted that most of the Gospels were suspect or written too late to be eyewitness accounts, they lacked coherence. Arguments about Jesus himself were full of conjecture. Some books were no more than assumptions piled upon assumptions, absurd conclusions reached on the basis of little or no data at all. In some, the whole case for the non-divine Jesus who stumbled into Jerusalem and somehow got crucified by nobody and had nothing to do with the founding of Christianity and would be horrified by it if he knew about it. That whole picture that had floated in liberal circles I frequented as an atheist for 30 years, that case was not made. Not only was it not made, I discovered in this field some of the worst and most biased scholarship I'd ever read. And so the reality is Mark goes through great pains to tell you, I'm not saying here's real life and then here's some spiritual things to believe if it makes you feel good. What I'm telling you is the divine broke into history, and Mark takes great pains to verify that. And the question is, will you? Do you have the courage to go on a journey to say, is this true? Did this guy who changed human history more than any other person really live, really die, and really live again? Because if he did, that guy said he was God and demands my allegiance. And you must deal with this guy. No one changed history like him. And he thought he was God, and his people believed he rose. Please deal with this man. There is nothing more important you can do in your young life than investigate the claims of Jesus. And yet, here's the good news for all of us. This is true regardless of how you feel about it. Some people say, well, you believe that because it makes you feel good. No, we believe it because it's true, but it will make you feel good. And you see that in verse 7. It has something not just for the head, but for the heart. It says, but go tell the disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. And I just hope you see the beauty in that. That he says, tell the disciples and Peter. Those are a beautiful two words. And you go, why did he say and Peter? I mean, Peter was one of the disciples. Why not just say, hey, disciples, meet him in Galilee? That would have included Peter. Well, I think we all know why Peter's being sectioned out. Because we remember where Peter was 2 nights ago. Do you remember his bravado, his self-assuredness? Jesus said, hey, all of you are going to betray me. And he said, not me. These guys might. I won't. And Jesus said, I'll tell you the truth. Before the rooster crows twice, that means before the end of tonight, you'll deny you even know me. And he said, there's no chance. And yet when Jesus is on trial and he sees his whole social circle mocking Jesus, someone comes up and says, hey, don't you know that guy? And they're in the dark. He says, no, I don't know him. You sure? Because you kind of sound like him. No, I don't know that guy. No, I think I saw you with him. And then he starts to cuss to show them he's not one of those religious people. And he says, I don't know him. And then Luke tells us not only did the rooster crow, he says Jesus looked right at him. And Peter ran and he cried. And I think it says, and Peter, because the truth is, at this moment, if it would have just said, hey, disciples, meet me in Galilee, I think Peter and the rest of the guys would probably say, hey, Peter, I don't think that means you anymore. Because you really blew it. And yet the beauty of this moment is he says, tell my disciples and Peter, I want them with me. I mean, just think about what he could have said. I mean, what he could have said to all of them. They all ran away. He could have told that angel, hey, pass along to them. Say, hey, you no good, backstabbing cowards. It's too late to apologize. Where were you when I needed you? You get no love. It's over. Take off. I'll start over. He could have banished them. He didn't need them. And yet here on the back end of the cross, to people who screwed up royally, he says, I want you with me. And the beauty in that, the beauty for our hearts is that's our story. That's our story. I mean, we talk a big game about what we're capable of, right? I mean, we do it. Whenever we talk about humanity in general terms, listen to us. I mean, we do it at universities all the time. There's all this optimism of with enough education and enough technology, look at what you'll advance. Young people, you'll bring us utopia. And you go, yeah, okay, all these general terms, it's so powerful, but just think about the people you know. And then think about you. How's utopia coming along? How you doing on that? I mean, it's fascinating. Newsweek did an article a couple of years ago where it said, it was publishing this recent study that said there's a remarkably consistent basic set of morality in human beings across a wide variety of cultures. They published this study that said these people went out to all these cultures, some that have no points of contact, and what they found was across cultures around the world, all these cultures had the same rough, basic moral list, which is fascinating, that there's no culture that thinks cowardice is something to proclaim or see as valuable, that all around the world, all these different cultures, every person has the same identical basic set of morality of these things are right, these things are wrong. That's fascinating. How did that get there? And yet, the most fascinating thing about the article for me was as they interviewed these people, they found they had this basic list. These things are right, these things are wrong. And then across the board, when they asked all of them about this internal sense of justice, when asked, this is right, this is wrong, yes. Have you always done what is right? Every culture answered no. We know what is right. We know what is wrong. Have you done what is right? No. Have you done what is wrong? Yes. Every culture. And yet we don't like to admit that. None of us do. I mean, we'll go, oh, okay, but then we make excuses like, well, look, you don't know my mother, okay? And you don't know the trouble that I've seen, all right? And so it's justified if I act this way. And we come up with excuses. But we don't like to just admit we're wrong. We don't. I mean, when's the last time you looked someone in the face and just said to them, hey, I just need to let you know what I did was wrong and it was unacceptable and I apologize. When was the last time you said that? We hate to say that. We hate to apologize. Why? Because there's something in us that though we know there's something we're meant to be, and though we know we haven't hit it, we have this irrational thought that if we work hard enough or keep going, sometime we'll attain to that, even though all evidence is to the contrary. And I think for all of us, if we admit it, if we just stopped and said, no, I'm wrong and I can't get where I know I should be and I'm supposed to be, that would just feel like death. To say that would just feel like total death. Of here's justice and here's me. And yet Peter's in this moment where he can't deny that. Everybody saw it. And he's like, yeah, here's what's right and here's me. And that's a devastating position when you grab that. I can't fix me. So I talked to one of you guys a couple weeks ago, and he said something a lot of young people have said to me. He said, I've got some Christian friends bringing me to Breakaway, bringing me to church, telling me about Jesus, telling me if you ask for forgiveness, he'll just forgive you. All you have to do is believe him, and it's over. He just forgives everything you've done. And he said, here's my problem with it. He said, it's my cute, sweet Christian friends that are telling me this, and they don't know what I've done. And what he was saying is, I know my internal sense of justice, and I know me, and I'm not there. And so if your religion is telling me, you're fine, you'll be fine, I can't believe that. I can't believe it. And so I sat there and looked at him and I said, well, I have some good news for you. And it may not sound like it is first, but this is good news. And here it is. Hey, your internal sense of justice, that's from God. And you know what? God, he hates your sin more than you do. And you feel like it's wrong and should be judged and not just blown away like, it's forgiven. You're right. It will be judged. God hates it. And every genocide perpetrated across the world and every cruel thing said to a child because you're tired, he'll punish all of it. No one's getting away with anything. And I said, I got to tell you now, all the wrong that you've done, he despises it and he hates it a lot more than you do because you haven't just hurt other people and wrong people. You took the gifts he gave you and used them to wrong and hurt other people. That's evil. Like I was thinking about a movie the other day I saw in the 80s. And it was this guy, he's dating this girl and she's a poet, writes poetry, it's beautiful. And he decides to cheat on her. And so he's trying to woo this other girl, and she sneaks up and overhears the moment where he's trying to romance this other girl and woo this girl, and he does it by quoting to her poetry that she wrote. Yeah, and it's meant to elicit that response. You're meant to watch that and go, oh, that is dark. That is not okay. And that is what we've done. We've taken the bodies he has given us. We've taken the mouths he's given us. We've taken the lives he's given us. And rather than honor him and help each other, we've been selfish and cruel. We've taken what he's given us and twisted it, and he hates that. And so I told him, here's the good news. God has a sense of justice much higher than yours. He's not sweeping anything under the rug. He will judge it all, and there's a place for that judgment called hell. And he will punish every wrongdoing. No one gets away with anything here. I said, and yet here's the good news. He has eternal punishment for this, and yet look at the cross. Because Jesus came and he told his disciples, hey, I'm going to give my life as a ransom for many. You deserve to die, but I'm going to step into your place. And he told them on the night he was betrayed, he says, I'm going to pour out my blood which will be poured out for many. I'm going to die instead of you. My blood poured out instead of yours. And he said, it is the blood of the covenant. A covenant's a binding relationship. There's a relationship you don't have with God. And because of your sin, it deserves wrath. It deserves judgment. And yet I will take it for you. I will die for you. I will be beaten for you. And I said, if you want to see the wrath of God, if you want to see justice satisfied, look on the cross. Because he who knew no sin became sin for us, is what Corinthians says. And God took him, and the wrath of God was poured out on him, and it crushed him. Look at the cross. God hates sin, and it destroyed Jesus, and it buried him. And yet I said, how do you know that what he said was true, that his death was really going to be for the forgiveness of your sin, for the payment of your sin, that he would take the punishment of justice for you? How do you know that? So, well, if you committed a crime and we put you in jail, how do we know that your debt to society has been paid? Because the jail door opens and we let you out. Jesus said, my death is for you. How do we know it worked? How do we know he really paid for it? Because 3 days later, the cell door opened and he walked out. And so he can look at a Peter and he doesn't have to say, well, Peter, you screwed up. Maybe if you work hard enough, I'll like you. He doesn't have to say that. Jesus already paid for it. It's already done. He can step out and Peter doesn't have to earn his approval. God has already paid for his injustice. Jesus steps out and now he's free to embrace Peter, to embrace his disciples and to say, hey, you're with me. I was poured out my blood for your sin. It's done. It's over. It's in the past. It's wiped away. I'm doing something new. And so I can take people like you and draw you to me and you can enter a covenant with God from what I've done. And so what he's saying is, you don't earn my approval. You don't have to earn anything. It's a free gift. It was costly, but I paid it and I've rose and I've come and I embrace Peter's. I love you, jerk. And he says it to all of us. Anybody who's willing to say, I'm broken, can't fix me. He embraces the Peters. He embraces me and he embraces you. The cross has afforded him that. The tomb has vindicated what he's done. And so he steps forward and his arms are open to every one of us who admits we're a screw up and can't fix ourselves. That's the beauty of the cross and the tomb. That'll change everything. If that's really true, if he really existed, really walked on this earth, was really God, was really a man, really died, and that death was really for you, to really pay for your sin, to really set you free, to really cleanse you from the guilt you feel and the guilty conscience you have, if that's true, that's revolutionary. You'll never look in the mirror the same way again. You don't have to spend the rest of your life chasing the approval of some group of people. You already have approval. Can you imagine that? That level of freedom? That'll revolutionize you. That'll change the way you see yourself, you see your friends, you see money, you see the trajectory of your life. It changes everything. If this is real, it's revolutionary. That he stepped into history and he cleans my heart. And yet here's the last point. This is a life-changing truth. And you know what? The angel knew that. If this is true, it confronts the mind, it changes the heart, and it challenges the life. And so the angel tells these women, hey, go and tell. Because this tomb's empty, you go tell people. Where you were going in life is different now because of this. The spice moment's over. You came here with spices, you had the spice idea, you were doing the spice thing, spice moment's over. Tomb's empty, no more spices. You missed the spice moment. Some girl anointed him a couple days ago. She hit the anointing moment. You missed the anointing moment. Put the perfume down. Perfume moment's over. That's done. Empty tomb changes things. Spice over, telling in play. You go tell, you go proclaim to the world this glorious truth that there is somebody who will save anybody. You go and tell. That's the new trajectory of your life. If this is true, that he really came, really died, really rose, that changes you and that changes where you go. Go and tell the world about a healer who's come. And yet Mark ends in the weirdest place. It says in verse 8, and yet they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. That part is actually not that weird. Again, whenever the divine breaks into the human story, it's a little bit disarming, frightening, and so it's okay. They ran a little bit, that's fine. But the angel tells them, go and tell, and then the passage ends, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And that's the end of the book. Credits roll. Go and tell, and they said nothing. And you're like, what? That's it? This whole book about what he's done, go and tell, and then they don't? You got to be kidding me. That's the weirdest ending possible. And I got to tell you something, that ending has bothered people throughout the centuries. So much so that some of our early Christian brothers and sisters just couldn't handle it. And so one of them wrote another ending. You can see it in some of your Bibles. It's there in brackets. And then we say, hey, this ending was not in the originals. It's just kind of a historical curiosity, but here it is. Because some guy read that and he said, go tell, and they didn't. They were like, but they did later, and it was really awesome, and you should check it out because they told people and it was cool. You know, like some guy just wrote an ending. And if you read his ending, it's basically just a summary of Matthew, Luke, and John with some weird stuff about snakes thrown in, but he just couldn't handle that ending. Now, obviously, they went and told people, or else we wouldn't know about it. And Matthew and Luke tell us they went and told people because we have those stories, and it's amazing that they did. But you go, why did Mark do this? I think Mark did this on purpose, because if you've been journeying with us through Mark, you know this is Mark's M.O. Mark does this. Mark always stops short of where you think he should stop. He always puts you in this moment that you're like, what? What? It makes you lean forward. Go tell everybody, yeah, and then they don't. What? You serious? And Mark always puts you in a moment where the last step is yours. He's been doing it all the time. You know what he's been doing? It engages you. It draws you in. He's doing the never-ending story. I don't know if you ever saw that movie. It's a movie from the 80s. It's just 80s night tonight. But quick story, last illustration. Never-ending story. A little boy runs into a bookstore, and this old man is reading this big, ancient-looking book. And the boy goes, "What book is that?" And the old man says, "You're not interested in this book." The kid says, "Well, sure I am. I love books." And he goes, Yeah. You love Robinson Crusoe, Robin Hood? And the kid's like, yeah. And he goes, yeah, those books are safe. And the kid's like, what are you talking about, safe? He said, when they're being chased by crocodiles about to drown, that's not you, it's just them. Those books are safe. Because this book's not safe. And then the phone rings, and so he goes off into the back. And the little boy at that moment does what any little boy would do. He jacks the book and runs. Right? And he goes and reads this book, and it's about a world that's falling apart and being overwhelmed by darkness. And yet as the story progresses, he finds out that there's a name. There's a name that if someone will speak this name, it will bring light into the darkness. If someone will speak this name, it will bring healing to the brokenness. If someone will speak this name, it will recreate what has been broken and crumbled apart. If someone will speak the name, it will bring healing and life. And so all the characters in the book are saying somebody's got to speak the name. And then all the characters in the book look up at the little boy reading. And he realizes this book isn't safe. It's calling out for me to engage in this story. And that's what Mark's been doing. You saw him do it when Jesus calmed the winds and the waves. Do you remember in that moment? Storms raging, Jesus calms the winds and the waves. And in that story, the disciples say, who is this man that even the winds and waves obey him? And then that's the end of the story. The next verse is like, and then Jesus had a sandwich. And you're like, whoa, wait, what? He ends it on a question. It's the weirdest thing. You're like, who is this man? And you're like, yeah, who is this man? And then they went off and you're like, no, wait, who is that? Jesus does it. He's talking to people and he said, hey, is the Messiah David's son? And they're like, yeah. And he's like, okay, so there's King David. He had a son that's the Messiah. Then if King David had a boy named the Messiah, why does King David bow before the Messiah? And they're all like, yeah, good question. Why? And that's the end of the story. Jesus walks off. He's like, weird, huh? And then he leaves. And you read that and it's just the weirdest thing. And Mark's doing it all the time. And you're like, what? Like he's doing it all through the book. You're like, wait a second, who is this guy? What's going on? And it makes you engage, makes you lean forward. Yeah, who is this that controls nature? Who is this that kings bow down to him? Who is this? And then he shows you, he is the God-man who died for your sin and beat death and rose. And when you grab that, you go, people should know this. And then the angel says, go tell people. And you're like, exactly, everyone should know this. And then they don't. And you're like, you got to be kidding me. Everyone should know this. We should be telling people that, oh. If this is true, I mean, if it's really true, you know, if he really lived, it's not just a story, he was here. Really thought he was God. Really died, and then really rose. And if that death was not just a martyr or a victim dying, if it was the perfect God-man being buried with the punishment for your sin, and then rising to say it's paid for and it's empty and you can be clean and you can be new and you can come with me. That's what I love. The term he uses, he is going before you to Galilee. That going before you doesn't just mean he'll get there first. Every time it's used in Greek, it's of someone leading. Thucydides used it of a commander leading an army. Jesus used it of a shepherd leading a sheep. What he said was, I have come and I have forgiven and paid, and now I'm leading an army of people, a flock of people, a whole new generation into a whole new world. If all this is true, it changes everything. It takes away guilt. It takes away shame. And it gives you a new vision for life. There is a name that is above every name, and it needs to be spoken into the darkness. proclaimed to the broken. Because this is the name that heals. This is the name that saves. It's the name of Jesus. This is the centerpiece of the human story. And my prayer for tonight for you is that this will be your story. Let me pray for us. Well, Father, I want to thank you that you are honest with us about sin, that we're all broken. And then, God, you tell us the depths of it. We want to think maybe we're just misadjusted, but we know the stain goes deep and we can't rub it out. And you tell us, yes, you are so bad that nothing less than the death of the Son of God could pay for your sin. And yet you are so loved that he did it. That he did it. And Father, I just pray for some in here tonight that they say, I want to believe it, but I have questions. God, I pray that they would articulate those questions and go on a journey to investigate this man. And God, I pray for some tonight that are sitting here and saying, I've heard enough, I've seen enough. I know the depths of my sin. I have fallen way short of my own sense of justice, much less that of a holy God. If Jesus is in the business of saving, I want him. I want to be on his team. I want to go where he's going. I pray that even tonight they would cry out and move from death to life. And you can do that tonight. And please tell whoever brought you or come tell one of us. And then, God, for those of us who know you, Lord, may we not embrace this glorious story, sing about it in here, and then fall silent in our classrooms because we're afraid. But God, I was just thinking about it as I drove on campus. There's classrooms and dorm rooms and hallways that I will never go into, and my staff will never go into, and yet men and women in here will. And I pray, God, as they go into them, they will carry this name. The name that's above every name, the name that heals, the name that restores. And God, may our story be his story, that we are free, we are loved, and that everyone is invited to go with him into the covenant with God made available through his death and his rising. God, may we celebrate that glorious day in history, and may we celebrate the glorious day of consummation. And by your grace, may we invite an ocean of people to rise up with us, to praise that name that's above every name.
Welcome to the Breakaway Podcast. We are back for our final podcast of the semester.
This is it.
Woo! Cue applause. And we've made it through the book of Mark, and we celebrated last night in a way that was totally fitting for what you preached on.
It was awesome.
It was an exciting night. Jeff Johnson was with us, and he even brought his parents along. They came in from out of town, and had a great group of people worshiping with Jeff and all the kids.
Oh, man. Did Because He Lives, real souped-up rockin' version of Because He Lives.
The old Gaither classic.
How do you rock a Gaither? We did it.
Mm-hmm. It was done.
It was awesome.
And, just celebrated, because we had Easter on Sunday. Church, the global church celebrated Easter on Sunday. But then we had the chance to, after you taught this passage of Mark 16, celebrate at the end of the night as well. It was so great.
I loved following that rhythm of doing kind of the Good Friday feel and then doing the Easter, just real celebratory Easter feel. I just thought that was a really fun rhythm, and I thought it was a great end to the deal.
Tons of fun, and I can't believe we've landed here.
I know. It's emotional.
Don't cry. So, Ben, as usual, we love this part of the podcast. Actually, we get a lot of people who email us and say thank you for this part because they feel like they get a little window into your soul, Like, who is Ben Stewart?
It's not me, bro. It's because they love them some Jeremy.
What?
And they don't get any Jeremy in the first half hour.
Well, that's true.
Not a bit.
Thank you, God.
And then here he comes in the back.
Here we go.
Bam! and they're waiting for it.
Well, I do love this part of the podcast because I get to sit here and make you share. And I love it whenever you can bring a little bit more into this moment than you do on the Tuesday night moment. So, I mean, Ben, I have a question. This has been bothering me since last night. We covered verses 1 through 8.
Yes.
But my Bible had a lot more in it. Why did we not cover that, Ben? What is going on in the world?
You know what's funny? We went on campus today, and I had several guys stop me and like, can you point? And the last guy, we had to go. We were leaving campus, and he's like, ran up and was like, I wanted to ask you a question. And I was like, okay. And he goes, it's about the end. I'm like, the ending of Mark? Yeah. And I said, just listen to the podcast. So
Oh, really?
Hopefully he's here with us.
Well, we better cover it then.
We're going to do it.
That kid needs his question answered.
He does. Well, here is the fun news. Are you ready? There's actually multiple endings to Mark. There is what's called the shorter ending. I'll read that to you. It is, but they reported briefly to Peter and those with him all they had been told. And after this, Jesus himself sent out by means of them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. And that's the shorter ending. And a lot of Bibles nowadays don't have that one. They have what's called the longer ending. And that's what, if your Bible has a 9 through 20, that's what we call the longer ending of Mark. And then there's actually a longer ending. There's the long ending of Mark with an additional scene where Jesus has dinner with his disciples and criticizes them, and they make up excuses. It says, and they made an excuse saying the age of iniquity and unbelief is under Satan through unclean spirits does not permit the true power of God to be apprehended. So they make excuses, and then Jesus fires back, and they kind of have this dialogue about no excuses, get out there. And so there's actually multiple endings to Mark. And what we've done is in modern English translations, we put that 9 through 20 ending in. But in my Bible, it is double bracketed. I mean, one bracket means you're suspect. Double bracketed, that's serious. And here's why. Let me talk about that for a minute.
Tell us what that means. Double brackets?
Yeah, this is good because there's actually, and I wish I could show you pictures, but I can't. But it's amazing when we find biblical documents like what you have. You have these pages from the centuries. I mean, it's unbelievable. We have some from like the 4th century or little scraps from earlier that you go, this is marvelous. We have these handwritten copies of the Bible from centuries ago. And they're obviously the basis from which we get our English translations today. And we did a whole talk on this textual transmission called Has the Bible Been Corrupted? And so if you have questions about this, I'm not going to go into all the details about how the Bible was translated, but you can go to that talk and learn that.
Yeah.
But essentially here what I'll say is that the earliest complete manuscripts we have of the New Testament are called Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, or they have little code names, B and Aleph. And they're ancient, and they were written in all uppercase called uncials. Neither of those have them. The next kind of strata in Bible translation that came later are called minuscules. The uncials were Greek, all caps. Later in history, they started using upper and lowercase. Those are called minuscules. And our two most reliable minuscules, they're not there either. And then after that, you go to what are called the versions. The versions are early copies into different languages, ancient languages like Syriac, Armenian, Georgian, Ethiopic. It's in none of those. And then after that, you go to the Church Fathers, because the Church Fathers quoted the Bible extensively, and it's not in Clement, Origen, Eusebius, or Jerome. And so what's happening is all through these 4 major strata of church history, you're not seeing this longer ending of Mark. And then when you get to the 4th century, which, Jesus lived in the 1st, so now you're talking 4th century, Eusebius says things like, the accurate copies of Mark end with verse 8. Or Jerome says, almost all Greek codices do not have this concluding portion. And then, like I said, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Cyprian, Cyril, these ancient church fathers show no awareness of these early endings. And so what you see is it's not really even at a scholarly level. There's not really debate on, did Mark write the shorter ending? Did Mark write the longer ending? Did Mark write the longer ending? Mark didn't write any of them. The earliest they show up are kind of some 4th century codices or copies. But one of the 4th century's ones it comes from seems to was copied directly from a 2nd century manuscript, and so these endings were probably written in the 2nd century. So not crazy long after Jesus, but really all the times in kind of textual transmission where you see little additions in the margins, most of those came in the 2nd century actually, and so that kind of makes sense. And what happened was, I think, exactly what I said in the talk, that guys added a shorter ending just to give some conclusion to it beyond what they felt was an insufficient conclusion. And then someone in a totally different textual transmission stream wrote a longer ending. And so you had the short ending out there, the longer ending out there. People liked the longer ending better, but they didn't like the longer ending. And so that longer ending kind of stuck around. But those were all, even when they were included, kind of had little asterisks by them, which meant this came to us later. And so there's never been strong, I mean, one, it doesn't sound like Mark. It's not the language he uses. And then two, it seems to be a summary of Matthew and Luke, stuff like that. But it came around later, is really what we're seeing. And I don't really even know of much debate about that anymore from anywhere. People are like, yeah, this wasn't Mark. The only debate now is, where did this ending come from? Or if Mark ended at 8, why? And different options have been presented. Some people have said, well, Mark was written, they used to say maybe it was written in scrolls and we lost the end of the scroll, but actually the New Testament writings were never written in scrolls. They were all written in kind of book form. It's fascinating. We really just learned that. And so some people say, well, maybe the last page got torn off. And so he wrote more than 8 and we just lost what he wrote. Or some people say maybe Mark died, like he wrote 8 and then died and never got to finish the book. And so some other people came along later and tried to kind of tie up an ending, which is possible. My theory that I believe is the one I presented in the talk, which is Mark ended it at 8. It seems consistent with Mark's style through his book. So I think Mark intended to end it at 8, and the earliest copies we have of it all kind of testify to that. So I feel very comfortable with that. But again, you'll have some people who want to defend 9 through 20 being part of the Bible. And I just don't think that's necessary. So I don't preach it as a biblical text. So.
Well, what's cool is the way you, in the talk last night, is challenging even those who heard it and those of you who just listened to it on the podcast. Of now we carry that. We go with this message and we don't sit on it and we don't hide it, but we share it. So
I think there's a good argument from seeing Mark's style, and that's what I presented some examples of, where he's always stopping short and making the last step yours. He's been doing that. And so to do it at the end, it is kind of weird. It is a little abrupt. You're like, oh, and so it's natural to hear people say, well, we should maybe tell people a little more than this, Mark. But I don't think it's inconsistent with Mark to have it ended there. And you got to think Mark was written very early. Most scholars now believe he was the first one written. And so he didn't feel the need to fill in some pieces that living witnesses were all testifying to. He was writing the account to Peter, and then once you got to these other things, he wasn't attesting to all of them. Really, the Gospels, a lot of their formation happened because eyewitnesses were dying, and they were like, we need a faithful written copy of this because we're losing some of our eyewitnesses. Like, we don't feel the need to write the history of Breakaway from 2008 to 2011 because we're all here. But if we started dying off, someone would go, someone needs to write this down. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. And it's that kind of natural thing that happened. So anyway, I don't know what else to say than that. But
how would you wrap up this whole semester series of the Gospel according to Mark?
Yeah, I would say, my hope that we said at the beginning was for the believer to meditate upon Jesus and to think about him. And I would invite them to do that. Read Mark again. If you want to go deeper into study, Darrell Bock's Jesus According to Scripture. It's a great book. William Lane's commentary on Mark is, I think, the best. William Lane, Lane. Tim Keller just put out a book on Mark, and I referenced Keller a lot. Probably should have named him more, quite honestly, but it was hard to. I got this from Bock. I got this from Lane. I got this from. But those three men really influenced this Mark series. And so if you want to study Mark, go to those places. Study a different gospel. Darrell Bock's book would get you started in that direction. But I'd say meditate on Jesus, because the more we look at him, the more we look like him. Often is the case. And so my hope is that believers would cherish him more and think about him more, and then go, like we said, say, if this is the name that heals the nations, I'm going to carry this name. And my hope is Christians launch out in the summer and go, I'm not just a waiter. I am a waiter who knows the name that can heal the nations. And so I am carrying that into this restaurant, and that's who I am in this restaurant, or who I am in this office, or who I am in this neighborhood. And I just pray people will hit their knees and go, God, what does that mean? How do I do that? How do I say it? And struggle to say, how do I testify to this? And then for the non-believer, just like I said, I pray that you'll take him seriously, that you'll really not commit the sin of believing silly, dismissive arguments that you heard once because you actually don't want to deal with this guy. But have the intellectual integrity to say, he really did change history. Just objective fact. A carpenter changed the whole world. I should investigate this guy. And I just pray you will, because he welcomes honest inquisitors. And I think if you seek him, you'll find him. And what you'll find is not just a nice religious character or a good guy. He didn't leave that open. He said, you either crown me or kill me. And I think you'll find not just someone who will help you live your life. I think you'll find the center of the human life. This guy is the centerpiece of human history. And I just want you to love him. So that's my heart.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
We have enjoyed this whole series, so we're looking forward to, what'll happen in the next few months over the summer, and we're definitely not going to go away, but we will pop up here and there throughout the summer and stay connected. And the best way to do that is to subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, so that when you pull up your little iTunes on your computer, it'll refresh and you'll get us in your little folder there.
So we'll wrap up Breakaway up here. So if you want to join us Tuesday night, come on. And then we'll sleep for about a week or so.
We'll be like bears. We'll hibernate.
Go into recovery mode. And then, we'll pop back out this summer. And I can't wait. That's always fun. So I think we'll have a good time with that. So stay with us.
Yep, for sure. So we have All Worship Breakaway, which is next week here at Reed Arena, which will be our final kind of moment here for the 2010-2011 academic year. And we're going to honor some of our graduating seniors, have them stand, pray for them, honor some of the people who have been coming to Breakaway, and some cool stuff's happened in their life, and do that. And then, it's going to be crazy.
We love it.
Wrap it up.
Come on.
It's going to be great. So, but thank you guys for listening to us and journeying through this whole gospel. It's been pretty epic. I mean, the fact that we covered a whole gospel in one semester. So
I think it worked. It was crazy, but I'm so glad we did it.
Me too.
It's been a great spring with Shalom and the gospel. I have loved this season together. I think we've had a real sweet time together.
Very
Thanks
cool.
for being with us.
Yep. Thank you so much. We'll see you soon.